Hi, everyone. Welcome. We're going to just take a couple minutes for more people to join us. Thanks for being here. In the meantime, if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat window, please go ahead. Let us know where you're dialing in from. This is about intercultural communication, so we'd love to know what cultures you're representing too. So let us know about you. You won't be able to see what you post in the chat if you say hello in the chat, but I will be able to see it. And so hopefully I can recognize you there or bring up different points about different places along the way. So far, we have people from Oxfordshire. Hi, Denise. We have someone from Luxembourg, Olivier. We have Eric from Sweden, Manal from Abu Dhabi, flying in. Okay, lots of names here. Franco from Mexico, Pia from Munich. Hi, Lydia in Rome. It's all going rather fast to read all of them. But Beata from Poland, welcome. And Nadia from an Italian living in Luxembourg, fantastic. Brazilian living in Switzerland, Patricia. We have Adele from Syria. Reina from the Philippines. Chiara from Rome. Jenny from London. Janice from Bath. Mahmoud from Libya. Great crowd. Please keep introducing yourselves and as we come into the room, and then I will get started in just a moment. Hi, Yaya from Oman, Aini from Pakistan, Ralph from Madrid. Fantastic. Welcome, everyone. So for those of you just joining us, I've been inviting people to say hello in the chat to let me know where they're from and also maybe what cultures you represent, because we are talking about intercultural communication. And sometimes we may live somewhere but represent an entirely different perspective where we are. Meta from Denmark, Christopher from Sweden, Julia, British living in the Netherlands, hi. Okay, Christophe from near Geneva, Jonas from Sweden, Clément from Paris. Venu represents Hindu culture, Sarah from Saudi Arabia. Fantastic, everyone. Keep that going, and we'll be able to refer back to that later. I'd like to point out that we do have the chat window. You won't be able to see everything that's listed there because there's so many of you, but I can try to keep an eye on it and refer to it. Belen from Madrid, welcome. So thank you all very much for joining me today. This session is about intercultural communication. And specifically, we're talking about sustaining clarity and engagement in times of global crisis. But I think there's broader themes here for us to be exploring and thinking about in terms of how we communicate with each other. How do we bring in different perspectives and empathy as we try to communicate when it's urgent and with transparency? And so this is part of a series of webinars that we are running on behalf of EF Education First and Halt Ashridge Executive Education. And if you're not familiar with the organization, EF Education First provides intercultural experiences, experiential learning for languages, for culture, cultural exchange, educational travel, as well as international business education. And Halt Ashridge Executive Education provides leadership training with over 60 years of experience working with global companies across all of its campuses. And it has the distinction of being a triple accredited leading international business school. So we are delivering these webinars in order to raise awareness of key topics that affect all of us right now in the circumstances that we're living in at the moment. And in the webinar that we're exploring today, that I'm going to be walking you through, this is really a chance for us to reflect on experience. To reflect on our experiences in order to go somewhere with that, to develop our leadership, to be more agile in our leadership, and how we work with others to engage others. We're going to explore the nature of intercultural communication, and we're also going to consider some of the implications for language fluency on understanding, especially when it's across cultures and borders. There will be time for questions and answers at the end. So I do invite you to also find the Q&A window at the top of your Zoom screen or wherever it's located. You can submit a question there, and at the end, I'll be able to see a list of questions that have been submitted, and I'll do my best to try to address common themes there or specific questions. And we have the chat window as well, as I mentioned, which you won't be able to see yourself, but I can keep an eye on and have a sense of what's there and be able to try to pick up any points as well. Okay, so This is part of the HALT Online Skills program, but this is something of a session for us to impart some of the experience we have, the research we have, the best practice that we are aware of, but this isn't the whole picture in this one webinar. So HALT Online Skills is something you might want to investigate more, which there's a link below, but it's a way to have distance learning access to learning and development opportunities. So I do invite you to copy that link, take a snapshot of it, and come and visit that particular program. And you can learn more about this at the end as well. There will be another description. So now it's time for me to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Christopher McCormick. I'm joining you today from London. I divide my time between London and Lucerne in Switzerland. You may hear from my voice that I'm not actually British and I'm not Swiss either. So I was born in the United States. I'm from Texas originally. And I have now lived and worked in many countries around the world, thanks to having a dream job with EF, where I have been able to work with companies and governments and schools and learners all around the world in order to develop their communication skills, their cultural skills, their leadership skills, and their language fluency. By way of background, I was a teacher. In the past, I taught languages, always fascinated about different cultures from a very young age. And especially growing up where I did in Texas, which is a very interesting melting pot of cultures along a border and also a wide open space that has welcomed immigrants from around the world. So despite Texas having a certain reputation around the world, it actually is a quite diverse place where you get a sense of a wider world around you. But I also knew that Texas wasn't for me long term because I wanted to explore the world. I wanted to go to wherever I possibly could. We hosted exchange students in my family when I was young. I subsequently went to visit and stay with them in different countries. And then my own career interests took me into wanting to work on better understanding across borders and cultures. I grew up during the Cold War period. I grew up where there was a lot of fear and apprehension and tension in the United States about what was happening outside the borders, where the threats were. And I never quite accepted that because of different experiences and cultural contact that I had had from a young age. I knew that there were other ways to try to see the world and understand each other. So that's been my life's work, has been trying to educate myself and help to educate others about what lies beyond. And so my work here today is to walk us through some considerations and questions that you might want to explore to be a better communicator when you're working in an international environment. Now, in the course of my work experience, I've lived in China, I've lived in Mexico, I've lived in France, Switzerland, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, the United Kingdom, and of course the United States. And I've traveled to many, many more countries working on international projects and also just for tourism. But that's been my really work has brought me to these places and curiosity, but also my life as well. So I'm married to a diplomat. And so he and I travel the world together to go and live in different embassy postings. So from an entirely different perspective as diplomatic family, I've also seen the world at its best and worst and how it survives in difficult challenges. So with that combination of work and life and educational experiences, I've had something of a front row seat to some of the world's biggest crises and seen how people respond and seen how people communicate and how they try to project leadership in very uncertain environments or circumstances that are changing all the time. I mean, that runs from the 9/11 crisis to the volcanic ash crisis that grounded planes worldwide with people stuck in so many places, SARS, now coronavirus, financial crises, and so forth. Throughout all of this time working with EF, where I've been for 22 years, and also working and living in different countries alongside an embassy's functioning, I've seen how different people tackle the similar challenge. And one of the things that I find fascinating to consider, and I really invite you to think about, is what is authentic leadership? If that's the goal, people talk so often about wanting to be authentic and to be transparent. What is authentic leadership when you're doing that in a third language, a fourth language, a fifth language? What does it mean to be an authentic leader who communicates well and brings people on board if they're doing this across borders and across cultures? And that's really the heart of what I'd like to explore today. So now that I've introduced myself, I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video so that it's a little easier, and I don't want any risk of the signal being weak. So I'm going to just stop the video, but I'll come back on when we have Q&A later. So how do you project authentic leadership across borders, languages, and cultures? What could possibly go wrong? So I'd like to ask you a quick question in the form of a poll. So this is based on a scenario where you're thinking of a company or an organization that has lots of people communicating during difficult challenges or trying to bring a lot of people on board through engagement and trying to retain people and motivate people and engage them. So here's your poll. What leadership communication problem do you think would have the biggest impact on company targets, either with staff targets for retention and engagement, or targets for innovation, or even on their returns or revenue? What communication problems do you think might occur? So have a quick think and tell me whether you think this might be due to clarity, the actual clarity of the message. Is it something that people actually understand through language that is accessible? Could it be a problem with the use of informal language or casual language, what we call colloquial language? Or what about inconsistent messaging? Different people having different spins, or the message changing continually, as we see very often with government responses to a crisis. What about lack of sensitivity to local issues? Or what kind of problem may occur, would you say, that lack of empathy with the workforce could be behind? So think about your choice, and once we have some answers in there, then we'll be able to reveal that, and we'll have a sense of where you are now. And then what I'm going to do once we have our results is I'm going to then share with you some results of some research that we did that may be revealing for you. We have been working with global companies around the world with both EF Corporate Solutions and with Hult-Ashridge Executive Education, where we look at what does it mean to communicate with the workforce? What does it mean to promote innovation and leadership in an international context? What does it mean to reflect on experience and develop your leadership in a more agile way? And in the particular research that we were looking at, we wanted to figure out what problems actually arise in terms of communication. So if we have the results, maybe we could probably show those to you now, I hope. There we go. So have a look at how people answered. So lack of clarity emerged on top, followed by inconsistent messaging and a lack of empathy with the workforce. Great, okay. So this is quite interesting because I think you're going to see echoes of this in the results of the research as well, and also the messages that we'll talk about in a moment. Let me just remove that from the screen. This is what the research showed us, and I wanted to highlight to you how this works. So we looked at many companies and asked the leaders there to tell us, what do you observe? What are the problems that are observed with communication from senior leaders? And the companies are divided between those who met their targets in terms of retention, innovation, and revenue, versus those who didn't achieve their targets. So the companies in green, you can see, had fewer examples of these problems. And lack of clarity was number one, in line with what you said. The companies in blue were the companies who did not meet all of their targets, and they had more problems observed in the organizations. And you see here that it's almost pretty even across the board, but lack of clarity and the lack of empathy with the workforce were the two that emerged as most critical. And it's this kind of data, this kind of evidence, which gives us a chance to reflect on what does that mean for how we run our organizations and how we communicate. And in another fantastic study conducted by EF and Ashridge, Hult-Ashridge, we called Developing Leaders for the 21st Century, and this came out last year. The research followed up on a key question for senior leaders around the world. And it was really about reflecting on experience. If you think about problems you've occurred, the lessons that you've learned, and what you're going to do about it, this was a very powerful question to ask. And it's something I would ask you now in the context of communication. What do you know now about leading others and being your best that you wish you had known 10 years ago? And this is what people were sharing with us. And it was really quite honest. It was wonderful to see how people were able to reflect on their experience and realize what they needed to know before. And if you see the themes that emerge, relational skills, emotional intelligence, politics, and you think about how those lessons were learned, these critical incidents, through failure, through personal development and experience, major life events, lack of self-confidence, you see here that there's not a very large role for a school curriculum. There's not a role here for a formal education. These are not instinctive responses that you're trained to do in a curriculum. This comes from reflecting on experience and learning through failure, learning through going through a challenging time and developing from it. And so if you think about the context of communication, we see these themes emerge around people skills, relational skills, and emotional intelligence, which implies that you are working to understand others, as well as working to understand yourself. Now, these leaders went on to answer the question then, what would enable you to develop? And thinking forward, now we've looked back and reflected on experience, thinking forward, how could we be better at this? We see, again, it's very proactive learning through doing, through other people, some formal development, extracurricular learning, but again, themes of growth mindset, intercultural competence, and emotional intelligence emerge again. So these are key themes that we revisit quite often when we work with people on developing leadership skills, because ultimately what we're trying to do is help people see themselves in a new light, and that allows them to be more effective and have a more powerful impact wherever they go. The more self-awareness you have can help drive how you see others and how you interact with the world around you. So take a moment and just read and think about what this quote means for you. Who looks outside dreams, and who looks inside awakes. And that is the heart of intercultural communication, self-awareness first. Because understanding more where you're coming from will really help to be able to develop that empathy that is so essential for getting your message across. And what we see is around the world, there's far more interest now in defining this competence that we need to work better together to create better relationships, better self-awareness, better empathy. And this model of global competence is one that is published by the OECD. And the OECD, which already does look at school achievement around literacy and numeracy and around the world in the PISA exams, is now also working with the concept of global competence and measuring that in school-age learners. And what we don't see yet, and what we'd like to see, is far more attention paid to this in workplace training as well, because this is what will drive the way that we work together in society, in good times or bad. And the model for global competence focuses on this understanding and appreciation of the perspectives of others. And so it all begins with that self-awareness and being able to be effective and respectful and unaware of what's going on for others. But that implies that we understand ourselves. So that leads us to really considering this question of values. Now, there's lots of fantastic work done around intercultural understanding and values. And I would like to draw your attention to a few different thinkers on this, researchers who may provide relevant information for you to think more about who you interact with and how you interact with them. And in their work on cultures and organizations, there's a really helpful model for thinking about layers of culture. And if we think about culture from the Hofstede point of view, is we have these several layers wrapping around a core set of values that we may not be aware of, because values themselves are something that are really learned very early on, and they reflect what we understand to be correct or incorrect. We may not know why, but we just know that that's the natural way to do things, or that's taboo, that's wrong. So this kind of decision-making matrix that comes through values is something we learn at home very early on. And that is surrounded in a culture by rituals. the things people do to mark the passage of time and to mark and celebrate milestones of life. And those are really dependent on the values underneath them. So you can see how people celebrate marriage or death or birth or graduation in different countries. We also then, wrapping around that, we see the imagination of the culture, the heroes. And this is what I always find fascinating, is how do people celebrate their heroes? What stories do they tell? What legends, fairy tales, real life stories, biographies, who captures the essence of that culture, the virtues that they want to celebrate? And that can be so different around the world. And it comes alive through the imagination and the stories we tell. But by understanding your own heroes, you can then be more aware of what's relevant in other places. And all of this is wrapped around with symbols. And symbols are the things you can see. You can observe them. You know that you're in London when you see those London buses. You know you're in the US when you see the yellow school buses. So those are the symbols. And joining all of these are practices. And practices are the things we do every day. How we arrive in the office and greet each other. How we go to lunch together or don't. How we sing karaoke after a meeting or we don't. Practices are the things that we do that glue us together and help us know that we have the identity of that place. But this is where it gets really fun and really interesting when you start to think about what are the practices that are completely natural to me that would not be natural for someone else? What are the symbols and the rituals that go into having a meal somewhere together or in a home or even queuing up in a pub in the UK? There are a lot of things that while we share a language, we may not share those same heroes, rituals, or practices. And I give you one example to illustrate the concept of heroes. Now, if you're not familiar with UK culture, you may be looking at this and saying, what on earth? Which is exactly what I said the first time I saw it. I grew up in the States, no familiarity with who these characters are. But this for me has been something of this represents so much to me about UK culture. And it's something I've come to really love and appreciate about the place. Because central to this story right here, in this animated feature, is this penguin who is, you may not know it, but is an evil criminal. And in this particular episode. And so you've got a chase scene on a train in a shopping cart, or not a shopping cart, but some form of cart, and a dog and this gentleman here. And that's Wallace and Gromit. And they are beloved heroes in the UK. And this tells you so much about what is celebrated in the United Kingdom around the concept of the underdog. The underdog is the hero who emerges from circumstances that seem impossible. They don't have the resources, maybe they're not clever enough, they haven't got the strength or the money or the muscle, but they somehow are clever enough and they somehow do have the resourcefulness to make things happen. And Wallace and Gromit, the dog and the gentleman, always come out on top at the end of the day, and they are hilarious to watch. Completely different from what I grew up in the United States, where our heroes growing up were cartoon characters, muscle figures, Superman, Wonder Woman, cowboys, pioneers, individuals with lots of strength and lots of resources. And it's always sort of this, there's a sense of adrenaline to it. It's a very different way that we tell our stories about what we want to celebrate and what we look for in other people in terms of humbleness, or is it something more gregarious? And this idea then of how you learn your culture becomes very relevant, because this helps you get a better sense of where you're coming from. According to Hofstede and Minkoff and all the data that they've collected, what they've looked at is how values and practices emerge. And I mentioned before that those values at the center are what are learned so early on, transmitted from parents and grandparents and the generations of the family tree. When you're born, so on the left-hand side, you have sort of the age at 0. You start to be treated in a certain way in a culture because of your gender. You're born and there are ways that people treat you. And then you start to learn those values in the home of different roles, of different characters in the household, different relationships. You learn the values of the community. And eventually you learn the values of your country. I remember very clearly when I was in primary school in Texas, United States, we had to stand and put our hands on our hearts at 6 years old and, say a pledge of allegiance to a flag. Now, that is an experience that's not unique to the United States. It happens around the world. But that is where it's at that age, young age, where you start to learn national values in those symbols and rituals. As we get older, we also start learning practices. So as we transition from the family educational environment to the school educational environment and to work on the right-hand side, we learn more practices about how to go about our daily lives. And the values themselves are pretty much set. So it's at the end of the line where you learn corporate values, because if you've entered into the workforce or you're of that age, you begin to learn corporate values and what matters for that particular company. Maybe it's the field you're in, but also that particular organization. So in some senses, corporate values are the last to be formed, and they're negotiable. They're things that can be changed. You can have one offsite meeting and come up with a new list of values. However, what you often see, and it's always interesting to really dig into this and try to understand it, is where did those corporate values come from? Because very often, the more you think about this and observe it, you start to see that corporate values tend to mirror the national values of the headquarters, where they're from originally. And that may work just fine if you're only working in a domestic context. But the moment you cross a border, or the moment you have a multinational team, things get more complicated. Because how do you embody corporate values that are actually a form of your national values if you're not from that place? It's much harder to then participate fully if you're not aware of what's driving what those values are meant to be. And this is where communication also can be at risk. So trying to understand where the national values, how they get manifested, can be very revealing. And one of my favorite forms of art, one of my favorite ways to understand a culture is through public art. And what are the messages that governments and people send out about themselves? And the more that you can raise your antenna and to think about what the public messages are telling you, the more you can think about how you might then communicate with those people. Now, I want to share one image with you that I find fascinating. This is from the 70s, during the time of the Cultural Revolution in China. Now, if you don't speak a word of Chinese or recognize a single character, just appreciate what this image is trying to do. Just take a moment and see what is being communicated here. What is being conveyed? It's rich color. It's a crowded scene. There's lots of people, men and women, different industries, different activity. And if you know the message, what the message is saying is, let philosophy be a sharp weapon in the hands of the masses. So it's actually an appeal to literacy and education of a particular philosophy. So this is really rallying people, a crowded scene. Now I'd like to contrast this with another public art. And this image comes from World War II in London. This is from 1939 from the Ministry of Information. And have a moment to look at the poster on the left and the message that it says. So here you have a soldier and a child. In 1939, this was during the Blitz in London when children were evacuated from London and they were sent to live outside. Could have been with friends, family, strangers, but children were evacuated from London. And yet you look at this scene, and this is a time of major crisis, and look at the scene is empty. There's only two people. And there's one guy saying, leave it to me. So it's a very different feeling about, who is involved here? Is this about one person? It's a very individual scenario compared to what we just looked at with a very crowded picture of lots of people being rallied together. And again, on the right-hand side, you have this image about keep calm and carry on. Many people are familiar with this now. It's been very trendy for years to adapt this, but this was the original poster. There are only a few of them in existence now. That was published around the same time. And this message, again, was an appeal. It was an appeal to the public in a very specific way. Your individual responsibility to keep calm and deal with the circumstances. So again, it's very lonely. Both of these are very lonely images, if you could see it from that perspective, compared to what we looked at before. So I'd like to put that in context a little bit with what dimensions of national culture actually say about national characteristics. And the Hofstadter research, again, looks at different characteristics that could drive the way that we interact, from, say, power distance, which is how much inequality you accept, in a culture. There's a hierarchy, and just the fact that there will be people who are either, they have more resources, or the people with more power. And that can be a very normal feature of the society. You have individualism. I think it speaks for itself, but looking at the degree to which a country has a more focus on individual achievement, values, existence, versus working for a group or the collective benefit. And then uncertainty avoidance, which looks more at how do you handle ambiguity? And in countries that rank very high on uncertainty avoidance, you often see very sort of strict codes of behavior. So whether it's, this is levels of formality in a language, or certain ways that you interact in protocol, because there is a way to behave that everyone expects. And I gave just a few examples here to look at different corners of the world. And this is not representative at all of specific individuals or necessarily entire nations or even regions. But I just want to show the spread and highlight areas, particularly when you look at, say, individualism and the difference between UK and China, where we just looked at the public art images. So this is another way to think about how people expect people to behave and how people expect to be spoken to and addressed. And likewise, for those of you who have not really had experience working in East Asia, then you may not be familiar with an entire concept framework for how people relate to each other. This comes from Confucianism, and it's called the 5 cardinal relations. And it's not something you're going to be told about in the airport on arrival, but you will be aware that there is some structure going on around expectations, that there is a hierarchy or a relationship where the attention travels in certain directions. So between manager and employee, or ruler and subject, there's obedience and respect, it travels upward, and mercy and kindness, and the welfare, looking after the welfare, comes down, and so forth. You can see across the spread here. And this kind of conceptual framework can inform expectations. How teams might expect to interact with an international manager may be very different in Korea, South Korea, or in China, or even in Singapore, than how they might expect to interact in Brazil. So I bring us back to public messaging then. So in terms of coronavirus, then I wanted to highlight a couple of examples that have emerged recently, just to see, but again, in modern times, how messaging gets out when we talk about, trying to rally people and being clear in our communication. In China, you have local associations, local neighborhood associations that are very often responsible for putting up public messages to inform people and to instruct people. And here, with coronavirus, which was happening during the biggest of holidays in the China calendar, the Chinese New Year, where people return home for a feast. So this message on the left says, no gathering for a feast is so that you can eat in the future. Not visiting others is so you will have relatives in the future. Now, this was the creative input by the local association who put it in. This is not necessarily a national message, but it just highlights the focus on the gathering and the relatives, collective responsibility. And so does the second message in another neighborhood. How to show your filial piety by having your parents grounded. So this shows us the initiative that's being taken, but it's still a message of filial piety, those cardinal relations, and also collective responsibility. Now contrast that with recent messages from the UK government. Stay home. If you go out, you can spread it, people will die. Very individual, very lonely messaging again. One person's face featured in just one of the posters. These are 3 different images that were put out. So again, a very different way, very direct, but it doesn't necessarily reference the family. It doesn't reference the gathering that we talked about. So this is how it's deemed appropriate to try to drive home the message in the UK, compared to how to drive home the message in a local neighborhood in China. And these are just examples to get you thinking. Now, one other tool that I think is a fascinating source of data, many of you may be familiar with, is Erin Meyer's book called The Culture Map. And in that set of resources, she talks about how people prefer to communicate at work. Now, with longer time, I would invite you all to do this as an interactive exercise, but you can do this in your own time and assess where you are in terms of your preferences, because countries tend to cluster around a preference for how to communicate at work and how to communicate messages to each other. And this informs how we interact. So I'm just going to show you on these lines, for example, my home culture. This is American. So Americans tend to be very direct and low context in communication. We are middle ground around giving negative feedback and communicating negative information directly. We tend to be slightly more egalitarian in leadership, a little bit more top-down in deciding, very task-based in terms of trusting. We trust based on achievement, your CV or your reputation. We don't need to go to dinner with you to assign a project to you. But there are other cultures where a relationship is the way that you trust and perhaps develop more business together or work together. So there's preferences along the way. Disagreeing, we're a bit middle of the road, surprisingly. People think we are more confrontational than we actually are. And I agree with that. And then from a linear time point of view, we prefer our schedules to be pretty fixed, but we're not all the way to the extreme. Now, you can do this with many countries with Meyer's tool online, but I just wanted to highlight this because it's so relevant for thinking about how we communicate. This is Sweden, and you start to see where the differences are, where they pull apart. And that's where it's relevant because you can see where tensions could happen in different preferences. A Swede down on the lower line on confrontation will avoid confrontation, possibly more than say an American. Swedes are famous for being very consensual in their decision-making and very egalitarian. So what could happen there? Where could misunderstanding or different expectations cause any kind of tension? This is Switzerland. So now you see a different kind of mix. And if you work in international organizations, you'll start to recognize where the trouble spots could be. And so the green now is Italy. And so we're looking at Switzerland, Italy, Sweden, and the United States in this example. And you can see, once you add Brazil, where you start to really pull apart and have lots of different frameworks for understanding the world in the room. So in terms of clarity for communication, to what extent are you prepared to understand where everyone else is coming from? And to what extent are you prepared to change how you would go about doing it? The last country I'll put in there is China. And you can see, in terms of these axes, China pulls very far over to the right. And in fact, there's no overlap. And I spent many fascinating and fun years living in China. I spent 6 years living there in 2 different cities, Beijing and Shanghai. And it was such an education to start to understand what it means to live in a high context culture, where the language doesn't tell you everything you need to know. The situation tells you more. The relationships tell you more. It's a real education. And it's something that I think everybody would benefit from, that kind of stretch. But here, what's important is to think about, what are the potential blind spots? What is it that you're not seeing when you're communicating with other people? And if we could put many more cultures on here, you would start to see where you might align more yourself, because you might be a product of a third culture existence. You might live somewhere else and be navigating many cultures, and you may have confronted this before. But it has everything to do with how we try to get the message across. However, you can take this message here. A person hears only what they understand from a very conceptual point of view. Are you equipped to understand it? Previous experience, intelligence, what have you. Or you can take it very literally. Can you actually understand the grammar and the vocabulary of what's being said? Because the reality of today's working world is that we use English among 2 billion of us to get things done. But most of us have had to learn it. In fact, everyone's had to learn it. But as a second, third, fourth, fifth language or more, that's 75% of the world's 2 billion English speakers have had to learn English in order to go to school, travel, go to work, and so forth. And so this represents our latest ranking from last year, looking at English language fluency around the world. Now, find yourself and find your organization. So if your organization might be based in Finland, or might be based in Italy or Mexico, but you may have operations in Turkey and in the Ivory Coast, or maybe Cambodia, or maybe Belgium. So what is the expected ability of the working population already for the people you're recruiting and hiring and developing? Because this represents English fluency of a working adult population. Now, there's a lot of fascinating data behind this. If you go to ef.com/EPI, you'll be able to see lots more information, data charts looking at cities, industry sectors, levels of management in the company. It's really fascinating to see how English is actually spoken around the world by working adults. And also what's interesting is to see where the gaps are. Because what we observe in the data is that we're leaving people behind who are actually in their 40s and above. And the strongest English speakers year on year, we've been doing this for 10 years now, every year, is we see the youngest generation is having stronger English. It gets even stronger once they enter the workforce. But there are implications here, because if we're not also looking out for the language needs of the older workforce who may not have had the same kind of English education when they were in school, who didn't have the same approach, methodologies that are more communicative now. So we have to think about how can we make sure that they are also supported so that they can receive those messages, engage in that communication, and participate. Now, that raises the question then of how fluent do you actually need to be to get your job done and to participate in these conversations. So I use this framework in my work day to day. I speak with lots of companies, learning and development professionals, and governments to try to understand what their language ambitions are. What do they need language for in their companies? For different leadership roles, for different international roles, because everyone needs to know how much they need to learn. It's not a one-size-fits-all puzzle. It's not something that can be solved with 100 hours of vocabulary training on an app. If you're going to have working proficiency to make a difference professionally, and if you're going to grow into new roles from the perspective of talent management, then you need to think about how fluent you actually need to be to get the job done. So there are 6 considerations in this framework that I'm sharing with you here. It's about what the need for language is, and this can not only be English, this could be French, this could be Mandarin, but the need drives everything. What do you need the language for? Ranging from a support function to representing your brand, the company, and so on. Then you think about the frequency. How often per day or per week or per month are you speaking in that language? That's also going to drive just how fluent you need to be. The complexity, as well as the audience, internal and external, will also influence just how accurate the language needs to be. How sensitive is it? The tasks you do, whether it ranges from the lower levels of reading basic instructions to the highest levels of speaking to media and being able to talk to a journalist or represent an organization or communicate a strategy. Very wide difference between those levels of ability in the language. And the last consideration on fluency is, what is the impact of you as a speaker on others? Are you of a limited conversational ability so people can't really rely on your understanding? They have to help a bit to repair or repeat to make sure you understand. Are you good enough for a global role or project on the need so you have clear and understandable English? Can you understand contracts? Can you manage project documents? Then you're going to be at that target level of B2, which is the Common European Framework level of reference. Many, many, many employees around the world are asked to get to about this level. But at the higher level, if you're going to have confident fluency, to be able to lead trainings, attend conferences, negotiate, that's at a C1 level. That's an advanced speaker. But that is actually only the starting level if you wanted to go and do a bachelor's degree in English in an English-speaking country. Or you wanted to go to Germany and do a bachelor's degree in Germany, you would have to have C1 German. So the workforce in the world is actually still very much targeting a level that is beneath bachelor degree level. So we really argue that people need to have a much better understanding of what people are capable of at different levels of fluency, what they can communicate and what they can understand, because there's a lot at stake, especially now. And for those who represent an organization at the highest levels, and the communication needs to be natural and effortless, and they need to be able to communicate a strategy, respond to media, and an evolving crisis scenario, then we're looking at even higher levels of communication. So I have a question for you then. How many hours of learning time does it take to become an advanced speaker? Let's say English, but you could replace English with any language. Some languages are slightly more challenging because of the distance from your home language, but in general, how many hours of learning time to go from beginner, A1, to advanced C1. Take a moment and think about that. And as you can imagine, working for so many hours, you have to have a diversity of experience. You have to have a diversity of exposure to different content, to interaction with others. So learning time here is not just formal instruction, but learning time here is really about the totality of the experience you're having, both educational input, working on the job and reflecting on that learning, and then of course, practical application that you use it in your life as well as in the course. So let's see if we've got a result. What did you think? Okay, so the majority of you thought 700 to 900 hours, followed by 500 to 700. Okay, and I like the ambition, the ambitious spirit of the 2% who said 150 to 300. The truth is, and based on consensus across exam organizations and publishers and language providers, is that it's in the 700 to 900 category. Because what you're looking at is a range of needs, and this is the actual description of language ability from the Common European Framework. And this just gives you some descriptors of what can be expected, what you should be able to do at different language levels. And if you're at that C1 level, where you could start to go to university in that language, but you could also do your job to have a more influential role, we are talking about 900 hours, 700 to 900, really. And there's different things that can nuance that, whether you have prior learning experience, what the common language is that already in the environment where you work, but in general, that's what we're talking about. So think about what that means in terms of the ability that you can expect for yourself or for others, messages that you need to communicate, and it becomes a very complex picture in terms of developing that clear communication, because you're thinking about the message, the content that needs to be communicated, but the cultural framework that it needs to occur in, and the actual word choice and the delivery. Can it be understood? So that also brings in the crucial skill, and this is the final thing I'd like to talk about here, is listening. And listening, of course, is a very challenging skill in your own language, but imagine doing this across many languages. So there are many models for active listening in the world, but I wanted to share one with you from the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development in the United Kingdom. And here they recommend, and I admit I changed the S in empathize to a Z. They talk about these stages of empathizing, acknowledging, reflecting, and summarizing. And these are the skills that reflect back to what we talked about earlier in terms of the lessons that leaders had learned, that they needed to have better emotional intelligence, better interpersonal skills. And it comes down to this: the global competence, the cultural understanding, and the linguistic fluency together enable you to better understand the perspective of the speaker and use communication that will get through, to package the message in a way that is relevant in that moment in time for those people. And being able to then engage with them to find out, is it being understood? Do people reflect back to you what you have said? How do you check that comprehension, and how do you summarize it? And there are linguistic strategies to do this in any language, to be able to summarize, reflect, and show your participation in a conversation. So then, to conclude, some thoughts. When you are communicating now, and it's urgent, and transparency is needed, but also to be understood, here are some things to think about. What insight do you have about the audience you're working with? And that comes first of all of knowing yourself better, but then also understanding who you're talking to. And how local is your own language? Have you ever listened to yourself? Do you use a lot of slang? Do you use a lot of local expressions? Do you have an accent that might be not so accessible to someone who's only learned in one particular place with native teachers in their country? How local is it? How much context? What shouldn't be assumed in what you're saying? But then thinking about your interactions, I like to think about this question of, what does disagreement actually look like? When someone's saying no to you, what are they saying? Do they ever say no? In fact, what does yes actually mean? Does yes mean yes, or does yes mean a whole host of other things that you might be overlooking? Again, it's about blind spots and trying to identify those blind spots so that you can be better prepared to deliver a message and understand how people are getting it. And that enables you to check comprehension and therefore to think more about how you can be a good guest. People are inviting you in to communicate with them. How can you respectfully do that in a way that's going to be relevant and personal to the people that you're speaking with? So I hope that this has given you new ways of thinking, perhaps, or frameworks to think about how you are situated in the world and how you are communicating with others based on what their expectations and their perspectives may be. So I would invite you then to think about this more. Explore the tools that we mentioned. Explore the culture map and the Hofstede dimensions to get a better sense of the cultural framework you're working in. But then listen to yourself more and hear how you are coming across, and find out from others what adjustments could be made to be more understood and to participate more fully and invite more people into that conversation. So thank you very much for your listening at this point. And I would like to go ahead and invite some questions. So I have a window of Q&A that I will go ahead and try to look at now. And of course, if you have other comments or questions, you can put them into the chat window, and then I'll be able to address that. Someone asked what the S was on the cultural framework, and that was Sweden. So you know that. Okay. Right, so I'm going to now look at the list of questions here. Okay, answer. So one attendee asked, where does belief lie in these layers? So in the layers around the values, the symbols and rituals and so forth. Belief is a very interesting question because we're talking then about probably, I would guess, community values. If we're talking about beliefs about others, then that tends to be from a position of a group. And it could be from a faith or a religious-based perspective. It could be belief based on geography, where you live and the lifestyle that you live. But that does exist in that values bubble, because the values are really, they can be personal as much as they can be social. Something to be thinking about, what is the source of the different perspectives that we have. And I have another question from Nancy. Can you transition these concepts to an organization when you have a mix of cultures because of mergers and acquisitions? Fantastic question. It's something that everyone is experiencing around the world. So many people are caught up in a blend of mixing cultures, and whether it's because of external change or internal change and mergers. Yes, of course you can transition these concepts in an organization, because if you think about, for example, in your example of mergers and acquisitions, what is the headquarters profile? What tends to be the dominant culture of that organization, where it came from, and how is that articulated in the corporate values? And doing an exercise to really look at the two organizations and figure out where's the overlap and where's the source of possible tension. And it comes down to that question of, once you identify possible trouble spots, then what are you prepared to change? What are you prepared to do about it to make sure that everybody can be included in the organization and have a more participatory environment? Because that's going to help the conversations you have and the communication you have. Another question. For organizations that rely on travel and in-person meetings, how can they ensure that they continue to share and transmit their global culture and values through communication with so many teams working remotely and virtually? Fantastic question, because EF, my own experience is I travel heavily for the work that I do because I'm working in a global role, which has suddenly come to a stop. Yet, I think about this a lot. I think about how we are now being invited into each other's homes. And we're being invited in to participate in project meetings, conference calls, status meetings, and you're in somebody's home and you're actually seeing how they live. And that is a very threatening position, perhaps, for some. It could invade privacy. It could highlight inequalities of how people live. It could highlight the conditions that people are in that they may not want to share. It could also give you a much better sense of who those people are. And so again, it comes down to that question of being a good guest. How do you actually approach being invited in like that? Because this is quite invasive now, that we're all coming into each homes regularly, daily, seeing people have breakfast, seeing their partners or their kids running around. And so it's a whole new way of working. And I think it becomes even more important for us to really question, how do we engage with others, and how do we now work virtually when we're actually going from point to point into people's living rooms or garden sheds. Another question. How can a good leader successfully combine empathy towards employees with the national culture? In other words, how can a good leader in an international environment present a specific message that will be properly perceived? So, if you're thinking about a particular national culture, and if you're not from there and you don't instinctively know the best way to present it, find an informant. One of the experiences I had living in China was not necessarily understanding what was really the problem under discussion, or what may be the direction of travel, of where is this going, this project or this negotiation. And because I wasn't equipped to be able to read the signs, to know the relationships, know the history, and of course, from a linguistic point of view. It took me a long time to make progress in Mandarin. As you all know now, it takes hundreds of hours if you want to get there. So I looked for a cultural interpreter, someone in the organization who understood a bit of my world, had studied abroad, had lived where I grew up, and who knew the home culture as well. And they were able to say, right, this is what's going on. So finding that cultural interpreter could be really valuable to help make sure that you're doing it sensitively. Another question. During a time of crisis and uncertainty, do organizations or leaders have a tendency to forget who they are talking to and the importance of choice of language? That's a fantastic question. They ask also if there's a tool to help evaluate it. Separate about tools, there's a host of tools out there. I would love for you to explore what's out there around looking at your intercultural competence. But yes, people do forget. When crisis happens, when people are stressed, when there's more pressure or more anxious scenario, people revert to certain habits of self-protection. Their language can be shorter, more truncated, and so therefore less clear, or it can go the other way and become too long, too roundabout to understand what they're really getting at. And so this is where it's time to sort of think, what are we trying to convey? And I showed you this example of the government messages from around coronavirus, because you saw two extremes there about what are you appealing to? Because if you're trying to get people to understand something, you need to appeal to them in some way to get that message on board. It's not enough just to hear it. So are you appealing to their individual sense of responsibility? Are you appealing to a sense of responsibility to a group? So thinking about, again, about how the cultural factors influence the message then can help you how to craft the message. Okay, we're getting a little close on time. I'll try to take just a couple more. Okay, here's a rather specific one. It could be relevant for many. How do I get management teams in Indonesia and China to say what they really think? And how do I know whether they're just agreeing when they don't? There you go. So that comes to that question of what does yes really mean and what does disagreement look like? And what you'll often see is in many cultures that are more high context versus low context. High context cultures, you probably never will really know what someone really thinks through the words that are said. It's because a high context culture depends on knowledge of the surrounding context and environment, relationships, what's going on. And so this is where I personally had to try to understand for myself, how do I then communicate in that environment? How do I take away enough information to know how to move forward, make a decision or communicate something? And part of that was embedding myself in the culture, understanding how they prefer messages to be said and done and participating that way. So I was prepared to change to an extent that I could, but also having somebody who was my cultural interpreter, someone who could just simply tell it in my own style to me in my ear, this is what's going on, 1, 2, 3. Because as an American, I grew up in an ABC 1, 2, 3 culture where we are super direct, try to leave no room for error. But not everybody wants messages like that. And in fact, it could backfire. Using ABC language, very direct and repeating things to people from very high context cultures can come across as insulting. You don't trust me to remember it. Why do you have to keep repeating? You don't trust my judgment. So you may see that those blind spots can actually work against you until you're really ready to embed yourself and try to see the bigger picture. So I hope that helps. Okay, you have a lot of great questions in here, and I am afraid I'm not going to be able to get to all of them, but I hope that I'm just scanning through. Um, okay, just a couple of things, some themes here about specifically on, how do you get teams to work together who are on opposite sides of the scales? Whether that's in the way they appreciate time, the management of time, or hierarchy. And I think for me, the answer is in self-awareness first, helping people understand that such differences actually exist and are documented. Because the more you understand about who you are, the more you're able to change. So being able to raise the awareness of what's going on for people can be very powerful because it allows change to happen, it allows space for change to happen. And perhaps people can then, from those different sides of the spectrum, can figure out a way to co-create a way to work together that will make sense for both. To what extent do people need to adopt some new practices, maybe change a few communication styles to smooth the way? But it begins with that self-awareness. And that's probably where a good place to stop, because I do think it all comes down to knowing yourself better and then being able to look outside and see who you are in the world and communicate those messages better. So thank you all very, very much. I appreciate your being here. If you have any final thoughts or suggestions, feedback, please share that in the chat. Not everybody can see it, but I can see it. So if you have feedback about this, I would love to hear from you. And I will invite you then to, of course, stay in touch with us, learn more about what we're doing at EF Corporate Solutions and with Hult Ashridge Executive Education. Here is a summary of some of the programs that we do that may help take this knowledge further for you. And again, I'm grateful for your time today. Thank you so much.